back. We will now proceed to look at the first scenario that we are going to be building, and that's what we call as a typical file-to-file scenario. The, as the name implies, what we're going to do is we're going to get a file from a sending system. There's going to be a sending system that is going to send a file to PI, and PI is going to receive this file, and PI is going to map this file, perform a mapping where it's going to change the structure of the file. And once it has done that, it is going to push the file to a receiver system using a receiver file adapter. There are a couple of things that I would like to walk you through this particular picture. Uh, excuse me for that. There are a couple of things that I would like to walk you through this picture. The first thing being the sender system and the receiver system. Remember, PI is an enterprise application integration platform, and what that means is PI is going to send and receive data from multiple systems. So at the end of the day, there always has to be a sending system for any interface and a receiving system for any interface. The other thing that you need to remember is when we talk about sender and receiver in the context of PI, it is always with regards to the end systems. What does that mean? When a sending system triggers the file to PI, PI is going to receive the file, right? So you might say, hey, this is an inbound interface. This is an inbound interface, and so on. But at the end of the day, what matters is that everything is with regards to the end system, and that's why the system that is sending the file to PI is called the sending system. The system that is receiving the file from PI is called the receiving system. And the adapter type, and what happens is you would define interfaces in PI, and these interfaces will have what we call as a direction. And out here, you need to remember that when we talk about direction, it is with regards to the end systems. It is not with regards to PI. And what does that mean? When we talk about a sending system sending a message to PI, the direction of the interface is going to be outbound, because it is the sending system that is sending the data. It is always with regards to the end system. The direction of the service interface that you would define is an outbound service interface. And when PI is sending the data from PI to the receiving system, again, because this interface is with regards to the receiving system, the direction of the service interface or direction of the interface is going to be inbound. So remember, an outbound interface is when a sending system is pushing data to PI, and an inbound service interface is when PI is pushing the data to the receiver system, because it is always with regards to the end system. It is always transparent of PI. The other thing that I would like to call out is this word called asynchronous, which is used in both the places. What does asynchronous mean? Asynchronous is nothing but a fire and forget. What that means is there is no response expected. So when a sending system sends the file to PI, the sending system does not expect a response back, and that is why the quality of service or the mode of the interface is asynchronous. What is the opposite of asynchronous? It is synchronous. A synchronous interface is an interface where the sending system will get a response back. So the first interface that we are looking at, the sending system is going to send the file to PI. It is not going to expect any response, and hence this is what we call as an asynchronous interface. Okay. The next thing that I would like to call out here, what is the sender file and receiver file, right? Again, remember, PI is connecting to multiple systems. So to perform this connection, we use what we call as adapters. And to do that connectivity, we use adapters. And that configuration, the adapters also have a direction. So what you would configure in PI under the sender system is a sender file adapter to say, hey, this sending system is pushing a file to PI, and the direction of that file adapter is sender. Whereas when PI is sending the file out to the receiver system, you will create a receiver file adapter. The direction of the file adapter or the mode of the file adapter is going to be of type receiver. Okay, so that's the first exercise that we are going to do. To summarize, we are going to have a file being created by a sending system. PI is going to pick up that file, and PI is going to push the file to a target system. We have a sender system, we have a receiver system. Every interface has directions. It is called an outbound interface, and it is called an inbound interface. And this direction is with regards to the sending systems and the receiving system, it is not with regards to PI. Every interface has a mode, whether it is a asynchronous interface or whether it is a synchronous interface. Asynchronous interfaces are typically fire and forget interfaces, whereas synchronous interfaces are where you have request reply, where you're sending a request and you're getting a response back. How does the connectivity happen? The connectivity happens using adapters. You will have a sender file adapter and you will have a receiver file adapter. Okay. So with that, let's move on to the enterprise service repository. So for this scenario, what are the objects that you would be defining in the enterprise service repository? Remember, the enterprise service repository, or the ESR, is the design time of your interface. So you would be building a lot of objects here. So what are all the objects that you would be defining? The first object that you would be defining, or the first object type that you would be defining, is called as a data type. A data type is nothing but a definition of the structure of the message that you are going to be exchanging. We will look at this in detail, but at this point, it suffices to say that data type is the definition of the structure of the message that you're going to be exchanging. Message type is an encapsulation of the data type. So a message type uses a data type. There's nothing much to it except that message type is an encapsulation of the data type. A service interface, remember we just touched upon that in the previous slide. A service interface is what is of critical importance here. A service interface has a direction, whether it is an outbound service interface or an inbound service interface. A service interface has a mode, whether it is a synchronous interface or an asynchronous interface. So you would define a data type, you would define message types, you would define service interfaces, and then you would be defining what we call as a message mapping. The message mapping is used because PI's role as an EAI platform, or as an enterprise application integration platform, is not just to transfer data from one system to the other system. It is also because each system would expect the data in a different format, which means PI needs to perform some mapping or translation of the data from one format to the other format. And that kind of mapping or translation is done using what we call as a message mapping. And the message mapping uses this object, message type. Do not worry, there's another slide that describes this. Operation mapping is an encapsulation of the message mapping. And you use service interfaces in operation mapping. There are multiple mapping types that PI supports. Graphical mapping, where you would use a drag and drop technique to do the mapping. You can write your mapping in Java. So if you're a Java expert, you can write a mapping in Java. If you're an XSLT or XML transformation expert, you can write XSLT mapping. If you're an ABAPer, you can also write ABAP mappings. The underlying fact being that multiple mapping types are supported, and in this first exercise that we are going to do, we are going to do a graphical mapping or a message mapping. Okay. So what is this data type that we are going to be building? This data type is nothing but the structure of the message that you're going to exchange. So you will be defining two types of data types, DT underscore source to denote the source structure, and DT underscore target to denote the target structure. In this example, what we are looking at is we are looking at the transfer of employee data from one system to the other system. And we've taken a basic data set. So in the source side, you will have multiple employees, and each employee will have one first name, last name. 1.1 means it is mandatory. The first name has to occur mandatorily. The last name has to occur mandatorily. The sex of the employee, the date of birth of the employee, and all of these four fields are mandatory fields. And then what are the qualification of the employee, right? If you see, this is called a 0 to unbounded. An employee can have multiple qualifications or even certifications. So that is what a qualification means. And each employee can have 0 qualification or multiple qualifications. And within the qualification, you will have one detail denoting what is the qualification of that particular employee. So this is what the source structure is going to look like. In the target, when PI is pushing the file out, the requirement is there's just one name field. There's no first name, last name, but the expectation is that this first name and last name will be concatenated and put into one field called the name field. Then you would do the sex mapping, and then you would do the date of birth mapping. And finally, if you look at it, there's one change. Here within the qualification tag, you had a details tag, but here within the qualification, you don't have anything. It is just a direct mapping out here. Okay. So what is a data type? Data type denotes the structure of the message that you're going to exchange. So you can define the data type within PI. And for the example that we are looking at, where we are trying to transfer employee data from one system to the other, we are looking at creating two data type, one for the source system or sending system, and one for the target system or for the receiving system. Okay, message type is an encapsulation for the data type. So because we defined two data type in the previous slide, you will have to create two message types. One is going to be called empty underscore. Empty stands for message type, source stands for the source message type, empty stands here for message type, and TGT stands for the target message type. And because message types are encapsulation of the source, empty underscore src will be using the dt underscore src that was defined here, and the empty underscore tgt would use the dt underscore tgt that was defined here. Then you would define two service interfaces, one for the sending system and one for the receiving system. So SIOA, what does this mean? SI stands for service interface, OA stands for outbound, A stands for asynchronous. Source, same way, SI stands for service interface, I stands for inbound, asynchronous. So if you go back to the first slide, remember, we are going to define one outbound interface and one inbound interface, and both of them are asynchronous. So you are going to define those service interfaces here. The service interface uses the message type which you defined, and the message type in turn uses the data type. Okay. Likewise, SI underscore SRC would use message type underscore target. Oops, there's a small mistake here. Let me fix that. My bad. So I will correct myself here. This is the service interface inbound asynchronous target. It was saying source before. So you would define two service interface. One is outbound asynchronous and the other is inbound asynchronous. One is the source and the other is the target. And service interface uses the message type, and the message type in turn uses the data type. Okay, and then you would define a message mapping and an operation mapping. The message mapping uses message types and an operation mapping uses service interfaces. Do not worry, this picture will make it all clear for you. Okay, service, so we've defined two service interfaces, SIOA source, which in turn uses the message type uses the data type. You have service interface inbound asynchronous target. This uses the message type target, and the message type in turn uses the data type target. Right, then you would define a message mapping, and this message mapping uses the empty underscore source and the empty underscore target, because remember, a message mapping is nothing but a graphical mapping where you're going to map the source structure to the target structure. So you're going to use the message types that you have defined in the mapping layer, and then you would define an operation mapping. The operation mapping is going to use the source interface, and is going to use the source interface, the target interface, and also use the message mapping. So at a very high level, to summarize, we'll just go back here. You'll define two data types, you'll define two message types, you'll define two service interfaces, you will define one message mapping, you will define one operation mapping, and with that, your enterprise service repository development will be completed for the file-to-file interfaces. Okay, so let's start our development. Okay, so I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back to my SAP GUI. How do I launch my PI server? I'm going to double click my SAP GUI, provide the client number, whatever is your PI client number. I'm going to log into my PI server. And how do I launch the PI homepage? I would go to the transaction SXMB underscore IFR. We had discussed this in the previous section as well when we were trying to launch the SLD. So once more, SXMB underscore IFR is the transaction, and this transaction will launch the PI homepage. Okay, so this is the PI homepage that we had launched, and this is what the PI homepage looks like. We have already gone through what the system landscape directory is. Now what we are going to do, we are going to go ahead and build our development in the enterprise services builder. So remember, PI for the enterprise service builder, there are three ways you can navigate it. You can use Java Web Start, you can use a web UI, or you can use NetWeaver Developer Studio. But for predominantly most of this training, we will be using the enterprise service builder. So just go ahead and launch your enterprise service builder. When you launch it, it's going to ask you for your username password. So I'm going to give my username password. Okay, sorry, there was a typing mistake in my username. So let me fix that. PI user2, PI, and now I've launched it. Now what if you notice here the screen is there's a Java Web Start launching. You saw Java 6. So PI was launched using Java Web Start. Click on this and this will, your PI will, server will start loading. Okay. Do remember that your PI, when you launch the enterprise service builder, you need to use your PI, the local machine where you're running the enterprise service builder needs to have Java Web Start or Java installed. Now there are multiple versions of Java. I'll go back to the browser. There are multiple versions of Java that are available from Oracle. Make sure that the JDK version that you're using or the Java version that you're using is compatible to the PI server that you're using. For example, this server is a PI 7.31 server, and hence the Java version that you need to use is Java 6. For PI, and let me go to the notes, okay? So for PI 7.31, the Java Web Start should be Java 6. For PI 7.4, the Java version should be Java 6 again. And for PI 7.5, you can use Java 6, 7 or 8. And if you have the older versions of PI 7.1, PI 7.11, you need to use Java 5. So these are the supported versions from SAP for the corresponding releases. So make sure you're using the right version of Java Web Start when you're trying to install the PI server. For beginners, what we typically recommend is if you have, let's say you're on a mission where you are going to use PI 7.31 and there's Java 8 installed. For beginners, the recommendation is that you uninstall Java 8 and install Java 6. There are multiple workarounds also available, but as a beginner training, from a beginner standpoint, what I would strongly recommend is to just uninstall all the versions of Java and just make sure that you are using the corresponding versions. Okay, and let me just note this down, session 3 notes. Okay, and let's just save this in a location. Okay, session 3 ESR notes. All right, so we are done there. Okay, so so now if you see, there's something new that's come up here. Okay, and that is nothing but our enterprise service builder or the enterprise service repository. So if you look at it, this is what the enterprise service repository looks like. You have this is the navigation of your enterprise service repository. So the first thing that you would notice is, what is this SWCV? Any guesses? Just think about it. Did you hear about this term SWCV? Yes, you did. When we were building the exercise for the SLD, remember we had done, one second, so here we go, SLD notes. Remember we had created a software component version, right? So SWCV is nothing but the software component version. Remember in the session 2, you had created a product and a software component. So within PI, the container or the package in which you will do your development is called software components, right? So now if you remember, we had created the software component in the SLD. Now you need to import that software component in the, okay? So what do you need to do? You need to import the SWCV software component version from the SLD. And to do that, first thing you need to do is clear what we call as the SLD data cache. Okay, I will show you how to do that. You will clear the SLD data cache and then you will import the SWCV from the SLD. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that first. I'm going to environment. How do you clear the SLD data cache? Go to environment and you'll see this option called clear SLD data cache. Okay, go to environment, clear SLD data cache. Let me note that down here for you. How do you do that? Go to environment and select the option clear SLD data cache. Okay, so let's do that. Environment, clear SLD data cache, and you will get the info message that says SLD data cache cleared. Okay, so that's it. Your SLD data cache is cleared. So now what's the next step? You have to import the SWCV from the SLD. So how do I do that? Right click anywhere in the open space in the free space and click on new. Right click anywhere in the free space and click on new, and now you will see an option on the left selected saying software component version. And what are we going to do? We are going to import the software component from the SLD because you've defined it in the SLD. The local software component version is not something that we will be using in this training. So remember, you define the software component version in the SLD, and now you're going to import it from the SLD. Okay. All right. So you're going to now select import from SLD, and now when you click on display, you will get all the software components that are listed in the SLD, right? So now this is where now I'm going to go into my SLD node 2, and this was the name of the software component we defined, right? Z training SWCV underscore 00. So I'm going to go here and search for this particular software component version. I'll repeat. Once you say import from SLD, okay. So here you will find the software component. Let's do this one more time, right? I'll click anywhere in the open spaces. I will say new. I'll select software component version. I'll say import from the SLD. And once I say import from the SLD, I'm going to click on display. It's going to list all the software components that are there in the SLD. And while it is doing that, we are going to take the name of the software component version that we defined in the SLD. Go here, give the name, click on go. It's going to take some time to search for your software component. And once it finds it, here you go. You see it selected that. So let's expand this. All right. Do you see this? Okay. Do you see this? Here we go. So this was the software component we defined in the SLD. So I select that line and I click on import. So select the line where your software component was defined and then click on import. And when you click on import, you will get this information and say create. Okay. Can we go ahead? Let's do that. So I'm going to go ahead and say create. And when I do that, this screen will open saying, asking me for the original language of the software component version. So this is a mandatory field. So I'm going to open it up and I'm going to select English as the language. Okay. There's a warning that comes up. You can ignore this warning, say close, and then click on the save button. Okay. So what happens? You imported the software component from the SLD. The first thing that EA Enterprise Service Repository asks is, please provide the language. I've selected the language as English. And once I do that, now I can go ahead and hit save. Make sure you press the save button. So here you go. You can press the save button. And once you press the save button, on the left hand side in the navigation pane, you should now see your software component displayed. Okay. And with that, you can close this and you're done. And your software component is displayed. And if you see, this is the name of the software component, and within that, you have the version. So SWCV training SWCV underscore 00 was the name of our software component, and 1.0 was the version of our software component. So this is the first version of this software component. All right. Okay. So with that, what have we done so far? We have imported one particular software component from the SLD, and this was the name of the software component. Sorry. So we have imported the software component from the SLD. What is the next step that we have to do? We will have to create what we call as a namespace. Okay. What is this namespace? A namespace is a container for your objects. Okay. So the namespace is a container for your object. So let's see how to create a namespace. Okay. So how do we define the namespace? Right click on your software component. Okay. Now that we've imported the software component from the SLD, right click on the software component and click on new. All right. There are two ways to do this. You can either right click here and say click on new, or you can click on open namespace definitions. I would suggest that you click on open namespace definition. So right click on the software component. Make sure you're right clicking. If you right click here, you would not see those options. Make sure you're right clicking on the software component version, right click and say open namespace definitions. you will get this message that says software component, your software component name does not contain any namespace, and then create a namespace. Yes, we know that the software component does not contain any namespaces and we are going to create a new namespace. So yes, let's go ahead and press create. And now you have this line here where you can enter the namespace. The naming convention for a namespace is going to be http://training.com. What is the name of your scenario? So in our case, the name of the scenario is file to file, followed by the suffix 00. Do you know what the suffix 00 means? The suffix 00, like we told, is to indicate that this namespace belongs to me. Like I was telling, especially in a training environment, it is recommended that every user has their own suffix so that it becomes easier for them to identify their objects. Okay, so I've defined a namespace http://training.com. This can be anything that you want. In this case, I've given training.com, followed by the scenario name. What is our scenario? The first scenario, file to file, and I'm going to say 00, and I can give a description, namespace for file to file scenario. All right, and then click on save. You can either click on save or you can also use the keyboard shortcut Ctrl+S. Okay, keyboard shortcut for save, to save your objects. How do you, okay, keyboard shortcut for save, Ctrl+S. And how do you create a namespace? Right click on your software component version and say create namespace, create or open namespace definition, sorry. All right, so now I'm going to save. I'm using my keyboard shortcut Ctrl+S. You can also save it. Cool. So my namespace has now been created. And when you create a namespace, you would start seeing the namespace within the navigation window here. So now I can close my namespace definition. And if I go to my change list, all my changes are going to be available here. So there are two steps that you need to do. Once you make any change, you have to save it. And after you save it, you have to go to the change list tab. You have to navigate to your software component, and right there, so it would be like this: navigate to your software component, expand your name standard change list, right click on this change list and say activate. Okay, let me write that down. How do you activate your changes? Go to change list tab, go to your SWCV, go to change list, right click and activate. Okay, so I'm going to right click and activate. What if you made a mistake and you don't want to activate it? In that case, you're right, you can reject the change. In this case, I want to activate it to make the changes final. So I'm selecting it and I'm pressing on the activate button. And you get a message saying standard change list activated. So click on close and now go back to the tab design objects. All right, perfect. So now let's open up the slides that we had. What is the next thing that we're going to do? We are going to define a data type. And what is the data type that we're going to define? We are going to call it DT_SRC. So let's go ahead and create. The data, all the objects in your enterprise service repository have to be created within a namespace. So in this case, right click on your namespace, say new. Okay, make sure when you say new, do not go ahead and create a new namespace. What is the object type that we need to create? We need to create a new data type. The data type will be available under interface objects. Okay, so go to create data type by going to your namespace, new interface objects and data type. All right, so let's cancel it and do it one more time. So I will right click on my namespace, say new. On the left hand side, your work area namespace will be selected. Make sure you select expand the interface objects and select the data type here. Make sure that data type becomes yellow, highlight it in yellow, and that would mean you're creating a data type. Make sure that you can see the name data type here. That would make sure that it is actually creating a data type object. Give the name of the data type. It is going to be dt underscore src. The combination of the name and namespace should always be unique. So this two combination will always has to be unique. So I'm creating a data type by the name dt underscore src, and I say create. The data type editor will open. So PI is intelligent enough to know for this object, this is the editor, and it will open the corresponding editor. Now I need to define 4 fields: first name, last name, sex, and date of birth, right? And so let's go ahead and define those fields. So I'm out here on dt underscore src, and I'm going to click on the plus side, and I say insert sub element. Okay, but before that, remember what we had told, one file can have multiple employees, right? So I'm saying employee details, okay, and then I'm going to say the type as 1 to unbounded. One file should have at least one employee, and it can have the max occurrences unbounded. Okay, so I went to occurrence and made it as 1 to unbounded. So under my source structure, I have an employee detail structure, and now within this, each employee is going to have a first name, last name. So make sure your cursor is on dt employee, and then select sub element, and sub element is an element within the element. So now I'm going to say first name. I'm going to type first name here, and for a sub element, I need to give a type. Okay, so I use the selection help here. I select XSD type here, and once I select XSD type here, I can see all the types: integer, string, boolean. There are multiple XSD types or XML types that are supported, but for all our exercises, we'll just use XSD string. So the first name has now been introduced. Now, our cursor is at first name, right? And the last name is at the same level as the first name. So what I'm going to say, insert element. Okay, and now I'm going to say last name. Okay, and I'm going to select the type. Okay, when you're selecting the type, make sure that you click on this arrow button here. Okay, if you click on anywhere else, you will get something like this. Okay, make sure you click on the arrow button, and then you select XSD type. And once you select XSD type, you can say string again. Okay, what's the next field? Sex. Okay, let's insert the next element. Again, I selected the option insert element, and here again, again I do the same mistake. Click on this arrow button, select XSD types, and say XSD string. The next element is date of birth, right? So again, insert element, date of birth, XSD types, XSD string. Now, qualification, right? Qualification is going to occur multiple times. So let's insert element, qualifications. Okay. Will this have a type? Will qualifications have a type? No. Remember that anything that is going to have a sub element cannot have a type in XML. So with that, my qualifications will occur multiple times. So I'm going to say it can occur 0 times, or it can occur multiple times. So I can say 1 or 0 here, and here I'm going to say unbounded. Okay, and within the qualifications I will have, so the details is going to be within the qualification. So what should I select? Insert element or insert sub element? If you're thinking about it, if your answer was insert sub element, you are right, because the certification is going to be within, the details is going to be within the qualification. I'm selecting insert sub element. Okay, and here I'm going to say details. I'm going to select the type as XSD string. Okay, and now I'm done, and I'm going to save this object. So what have we done? We have defined a data type source, and we have defined the structure. And if you see, this is a multi-nested structure where you will have an employee details occurring multiple times, at least with one employee, first name, last name, sex, date of birth. and then you have qualification of the employee, and you have the details of the employee. And each employee can have multiple qualifications, so it has got 0 to unbounded. Okay, so let's now look at what next. Now we need to create the data type for the target. So let's go ahead and do that. So I right click, I say new, I say dt underscore tgt, okay, and I'm clicking on create. Okay, same way, I'll not save this, one more time, right click on the data type, click create new, make sure that the data type is selected here, make sure you give the name dt to denote that it is the data type, make sure you know it says data type here, and say create. So the data type editor will open. Now we need to make sure add an element that says name, so insert sub element name, select it as string, insert the element again because it's at the same level, it's going to be sex, string again, then we have date of birth, let's call it date of birth, okay, XSD type string, and qualification that will occur multiple times. Insert element, qualification, and XSD type string. Will it occur once, or is it going to be 0 or 1? It can occur, that could be an employee with 0 qualifications, and here you say 0 to unbounded. All right, now that that is done, you can either save it by pressing on the save button, or you can do Control S. Okay, so I've done the save, and my data types have been created. Okay, what's the next thing that I have to do? I need to now create my message types. So how many message types am I going to create? 2 message types, empty underscore source and empty underscore target. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm right clicking, I'm saying new, and now it's going to ask me, make sure you're in the interface objects and make sure you select message type on the left hand side, and once you do that, give the name of your message type, which is going to be empty underscore src, and click on create. Right, remember what I told, message type uses data type, right? So this is the name of my message, this is the message type, and it is asking me data type used. So what is the data type? My message type source is going to use the data type source. So all I need to do is select my data type, drag this guy over here and drag him to the hand symbol. Make sure you drag him to the hand symbol, and when you drag him to the hand symbol, notice that the box changes to black. And when it changes to the black in color, you can release it. And voila, your message type is created. That's all that is there in the message type. Okay, save your message type. My message type is saved, I close it. Now the next message type is going to be called message type underscore target. So let's say empty, I say empty underscore tgt, and I'm going to say create. Make sure your interface objects has message type selected. You see message type here, give the name, make sure your namespace is correct, it should be file to file, make sure it is within your software component. Okay, and once all of that is okay, say create. It's going to ask me data type used, and a message type target is going to use the data type target. So select the data type here. If you don't drag it and drop it anywhere, just drag it to the hand symbol here. The hand symbol should turn black, and drop it here. And that's it. Your message type has also been created, and I'm going to save my message type. Perfect. What's the next thing? I have to now define a service interface. So I right click, say new. In the interface objects, the next object type that I'm creating is of type service interface, right? So I select service interface, I say SI. What's the name of my service interface? SIOA SRC, service interface outbound asynchronous for the source. So SIOA outbound asynchronous for my source, okay? And I say create. Now here you can select the category. It's by default outbound and by default asynchronous. And remember, the service interface uses the message type. So it is asking you what is the corresponding message type. I'm going to expand my message type here. My source service interface will obviously use my source message type. So I'm going to drag it here and drop it here. Make sure again this entire line is in black color. So if you see here, it's not going to let me drop it. But if I go here, it becomes black in color, and so I release it. Perfect. My service interface source is defined. SIOA underscore SRC, and it uses the message type empty underscore SRC. Save your service interface and close your object. Now let's click on, now we need to create the next service interface. SI standing for service interface, IA standing for inbound, A standing for asynchronous, and TGT standing for the target, right? So let's go ahead, right click, new, SIIA, service interface inbound asynchronous underscore target. Okay, make sure your interface objects, service interfaces selected here, and you can see service interface here. Click on create. Okay, what is the category going to be? It is an inbound service interface. So select as inbound. And now that you've selected it as inbound, what is the message type? Is it asynchronous or synchronous? This is an asynchronous interface. It's a fire and forget interface. So I select asynchronous, and it is, because it is a target TGT, target service interface, I'm going to select this message type empty underscore TGT, drag it and drop it here. You cannot drag it anywhere else. Drag it to this section, the whole box should turn black, and release it. Okay, let's do it one more time. Oops. Perfect. All right. My service interface is created. Now I save it. With that, so far what have we defined? We have imported the software component from the SLD. We have defined a namespace. We have defined a source data type, a target data type, a source message type, a target message type, a source outbound asynchronous service interface, and a source inbound asynchronous service interface. Okay. Did we activate our changes? What does this button mean? It means the change is not activated. So how do we activate our change? We go to change list tab, go to your software component, right click and activate. So I'm going to the change list tab. I'm expanding my software component. I see all my objects in my change list. I'm right clicking on the change list name and say activate. And it's going to ask whether you want to activate all the objects. You say yes and activate. It says standard change list activated. Now nothing is there in your change list. You see this becomes blank. Go back to your design objects and you see now the changes are activated. So what next? You need to define two more objects, message mapping and operation mapping. Okay, so let's see so far what have we accomplished. You define a data type. The data type uses the message type, and then you define a service interface, and the service interface uses the, sorry, my bad. You define a data type, then you try to define a message type, and the message type uses the data type, and then you define a service interface, and the service interface uses the message type. Now what we're going to do, we are going to use define a message mapping, and a message mapping is going to use the message types. All right, let's go ahead. So I'm going to right click. How do I define a message type? Same way, right click, say new. And when I say new, the section now I'm going to be interested is in mapping object. So select the mapping objects and select message mapping. Okay, select mapping objects and select message mapping. Now I'm going to give the name. Stands for message mapping, source to target. I'm mapping from the source file to the target file. Okay, give a name for the message mapping. In this case, I'm saying underscore source message type to the target message type, and I say create. So my mapping editor opens. So it's asking me here, enter a source message and enter a target message. What does your message mapping use? A message mapping uses a message type. So I'm going to take my message type from here and I'm going to drag it. Again, if you see, I cannot drag it here. I need to drag it to the point where it becomes black box, and this becomes my source structure, right? Empty underscore source, this is my source structure. It's asking me for a target message. Empty underscore target is my message, and I drag it over here to the black box and drag it here. Okay, we are good. Awesome. Let's do it one more time. Cool. I'm not going to save this. It's going to ask me, do you want to save? I say no. So how do I define a message type? I right click, I say new. I go to mapping objects. I select message mapping and I give the name for my mapping mm underscore src underscore 2 underscore target. I say create, and here what is my source message? Empty underscore src is my source message. Empty underscore tgt is my target message. I drag and drop the same. Awesome. Cool. Now let's do the mapping. So this is the target structure and this is the source structure. So we need to tell how is the target mapping going to be done. What is the name field? The name field is a concatenation of the first name and the last name. Okay, we will come to that. Let's do the easy ones first. Let's map sex to sex. So what I need to do, I just drag the sex here and drop it here. As simple as that. What did I do? I drag this and drop it into the target field. Drag it from the source and map it to the target, and you will immediately see that the red has now become green. Okay, same way the date of birth is going to be taken from the DOB field here. Okay, another way to do this, double click on the date of birth field. You will see the mapping editor open here. Let's drag it over here, and then I will double click it. I'll drag the DOB field here, and now I have the DOB field here. I can just drag this and draw a line here. Okay, and this button is to fix the alignment so it looks more organized and more professional, and you've done the date of birth field. Okay, now let's do the mapping for the name field. So the name field, I double click on the name, the mapping editor opens for the name field, and I need to do the concatenation of the first name. So let me drag the first name here, and then the last name. I'm going to drag the last name here like this, and now I need to concat these two. How do I do a concat? That's where you see this. You have a lot of pre-delivered functions that come from SAP for doing a lot of functionality within the graphical mapping. We have an advanced mapping session, so we will discuss all these functions at that point. But at this point, it's very simple. Let's select the text functions, and here you see there's a concat function. Just drag this concat function here. So what is going to happen? The concat function has two inputs. First name and the last name will be the input, and I drag this to the output. Perfect. It has now become green. So I'm able to concatenate first name. What I'm telling PI is use a text function called concat. Let me remove this, do it one more time. Okay, I'm going to use a text function called concat, and I'm going to concat first name with the last name and then map it to the target name field. Perfect. Now it's become green in color. Now what next? Qualification, right? So let's drag the qualification and select the double click the details. What should go here? This or this? Details. Just map the details. Again, mapping, the detailed mapping, we'll look at it in an advanced session. But for now, just drag the details tag here and then map it to the qualifications and do this. One another thing that you would need to do, and I will explain this in the subsequent sections, but now for now just remember, right click on the details, select context and say employee details. Okay, bring it to one level higher. Right click on details, context and say employee details. Okay, and that's about it. So let's save our mapping. How do we test this? Okay, how do we test this mapping? So let's go into the test tab. Now if you see, I have an XML editor, a beautiful XML editor. Let's insert an employee details, right? Let's say John Doe, sex is male, date of birth say 1st Jan 1990, and let's say he's done a BTech. Okay, and now this button is what is called execute to start the transformation. So let's execute it. Okay, so the mapping is successful. It took 4 milliseconds to to execute on the server, and perfect. What has happened? The first name and the last name has been concatenated as we wanted. The sex is shown here, the date of birth is shown here, and the qualification BTech is shown here. What if there are two qualifications? What if I have two qualifications? So I will right click on the qualifications and say duplicate subtree. I right clicked on the qualification, told duplicate subtree, and I'll say masters. Okay, and now I'm going to execute again. Okay, let's say MS, masters in science. Let's execute this again. Excellent. You see, now we have two qualifications, one for BTech and one for masters in science. What if I want to add one more employee? I right click on this employee details and say duplicate subtree. Right? Let's change the data a little. John Doe, Jane Doe 2. Let's make her a female. Let's make her 1992. And let's make sure that she just got one qualification, and let's call it she's a sports scientist. Okay. Now let's execute the mapping. How do I execute? I press on this button to execute. Voila, what happened? Why do we not have the second employee? Anybody wants to guess? There's a problem in our structure. I've done this wantedly because I wanted to basically not just make it work every time. So what is the problem here? Let's look at it, right? The problem is in the structure, the data type that we define. So if I go to the data type, if you look at the source, the data type is defined in such a way that I'm expecting multiple employees. But if you look at it in the target, the data type does not give me a provision for employee details. So I'm now going to go ahead and update it, and I'm going to say insert sub element, yes, and I'll say employee info, and this is going to come, employee info is going to come multiple times. So 1, 2, unbounded. All right. Now how do I move these under them? Okay. So I right click, I say cut node. Sorry, let's not save it. My bad. Do not save. So let's do it one more time. DT target. Okay. Out here, I'm now going to go here. Make sure I'm selected DT underscore target, and I say insert sub element. I say employee info, and I change the occurrences. Select the properties and make the occurrences 1 to unbounded. Okay. Now I don't have an option to move right in PI. So what you'll have to do, you'll have to select all and delete these lines. Okay. And now I'm going to insert again a sub element. It's the first element is called name. So I'm selecting XSD type as string. The second element is called date of birth. Insert element, sex, and the insert element, qualifications. Okay, here we were going to call the date of birth as date of birth. It's okay even if you leave it as date of birth, DOB, but I want to make it as date of birth. And here this is going to occur. This is XSD string. And the qualifications is going to occur multiple times. 0 to unbounded. Make sure it is 0 to unbounded. So let's just look at the data type structure here. Name, sex, date of birth, and qualifications. All right. Now save it. Now that you've saved it, close all of this, close all, and now move to your message tab. Just make sure every time you make a change to the data type, just cross check if the message type is getting reflected correctly. All right, the structure, the updated structure is now visible. So now let's open the message mapping. What has happened? Exactly, now the mapping is now vanished because of a change in the structure, right? So now I'll redo the mapping. Okay, How do I map employee details to employee info? So every occurrence of this, just drag the employee details to the employee info tag. Employee details to the employee info, the sex to the sex, the DOB to the date of birth, and for the name, what did we do? We used a concat. Okay, drag the first name, drag the last name, map the first name here, map the last name here, and then map the concatenation here, and we are good. Next, qualifications, right? In the qualifications, select the details tag, drag and drop the details, drag this to the qualification, and make sure that you switch the context to employee details. Right click for the details and switch it to the employee details. Like I discussed, we'll discuss the mapping in detail, but for now, leave it at this. Okay? So now let's test it. I need 2 employees, so right click, I'm saying duplicate subtree. Okay, and I'm now going to reinsert the data. John Doe male 1st Jan 1990. I'll say the qualification as BTech. Here I'll say Jane Doe 2, sex is female, and I'll say 1st Feb 1992. I'll say qualification as sports. Okay, now let's execute it. Execution successful. Now we have 2 employees like we want, and with the concatenation. Everything looks perfect. Let's add one more qualification here. BTech, here I'll update the data to say Masters in Science, and I say execute. Perfect, and my qualification shows Masters in Sciences, execute. So what's the next step? After I've defined a message mapping, I need to define my operation mapping. How do I do that? Right click, say message mapping, right click, say operation mapping. Make sure you're within mapping object, select operation mapping, give the name OM SRC to target. Okay. Make sure that the namespace is file to file, and say create. What does it ask? It asks for a source operation and a target operation. Remember, I had mentioned operation mapping uses the source interfaces, target interface, and it uses a message mapping, right? So let's select the source interface. What is the source interface? SIOA SRC. Drag it here and drop it here. Make sure it's in the black box. Now select the SIIA target. This is the target. If you see it's target, again drag it to the black box. Make sure it's black. And once you do that, select read operations. Press on this read operations. And from the service interface, PI reads the corresponding message types and asks you what the message mapping is. If you look here, there are multiple other options, Java mapping, XSLT mapping, and so on. So for now, we are not going to do any of that. We are just going to focus on message mapping. Now click on the selection help. It will show your mapping. Make sure you can see your mapping and make sure that it is within your namespace. This is why I had given the suffix as 00, so that I know that it is within my namespace. So I select the message mapping, and once I've selected the message mapping, I click on apply. And my operation mapping is done. So what did I do in the operation mapping? I select the source service interface. I select the target service interface. Basically, you do a drag and drop. You click on the read operations button, and then you select the corresponding message mapping and save on your operation mapping. That's it. Is that done? Yes, we've defined our message mapping and operation mapping. Is that all? No, you need to go to your change list and activate your changes. So I've gone to my change list tab. I'm going to my software component, and this is my namespace change list. I'm right clicking it and I'm activating it. Activate all the changes that are there, and it says change list activated. Voila, you are done. So let's summarize, what did we do. What we did first was we imported the software component from the SLD, And how do you import a software component from the SLD? You clear the SLD data cache, go to environment, clear SLD data cache, and then import the software component from the SLD. When you import the software component version from the SLD, you would have defined that in your first exercise in the session 2. Next, you create a namespace. The namespace is the container for your ROWL object. You right click and say open namespace definition and give the name of your namespace. And what is the namespace naming convention did we use? http:// vendor name / file to file _ your suffix. Okay, make sure you follow a similar naming convention so that it becomes much more easier to do your objects. And after that, what did we do? We defined two data types, dt_source and dt_target. And when we were defining the data type, we had given the structure as per the slides that I had shared. And then we created two message types, empty_source, empty_target. We created two service interface, SIOA_source and SIIA_target. OA stands for outbound asynchronous, IA stands for inbound asynchronous. And then you created a message mapping. And when we created a message mapping, we selected the source message type, target message type. We saw how do we do a concat function. We saw drag and drop mapping. We saw double click. We saw multiple types of drag and drop mapping rather. And then for the qualifications, we made sure the context change was done. Okay, don't worry, we will look at the message mapping. And what was the issue with the message mapping? We had a minor issue with the message mapping where when the file had 2 employees, only 1 employee data was coming, and that was because our target structure was incorrect. So we went in, fixed the target structure, and once we fixed the target structure, we updated the mapping, and then we created the operation mapping. And of course, save and activate your changes. Okay, so that's all that we did in the enterprise service repository. So what we have done so far is for a file-to-file scenario, we have defined we have defined the product in the SLD, we have defined the software component in the SLD, we have defined a data type, we created the namespace by importing the software component from the SLD, we created a namespace, we created the data type. The data type has a multiple deep nested structure. Then we created the data type underscore target. Then we created a message type. We created the message type underscore target. Then we created an outbound service interface. We created an inbound service interface. The outbound asynchronous, and you select the message type. And then you create a service interface that is inbound asynchronous. The direction is inbound asynchronous, and then this is the target message type. And then you created a mapping. And when we created the mapping, initially we had created it such that this employee info was not there. And then we had done added the employee info tag. And then we did the mapping where the employee info is mapped to the employee details in the source. The name is mapped to the first name and the last name in the source with a concat function. The date of birth is mapped to the date of birth here. The sex is mapped to the sex here. And then the details is mapped to the qualifications here. So I right click here, I say context and set the employee details here. Okay. And with that, we are done with the enterprise service rep. Oops, sorry. Then we created the operation mapping. In the operation mapping, you select the source service interface, you select the target service interface, you press the read operations, and once you do that, your mapping would get loaded. Do not worry, you would be doing these steps at least 10 times over the course of the next couple of sessions. So once you do that, you will get very familiar with it. So even if you have missed it, have a relook at the video. And if you missed it, do not worry, you would be able to follow it up in the next sessions as well. Okay, so with that, this session comes to an end. In the next session, what we will be looking at is how do you configure your interface in the integration directory. In this session, we saw how do you design your interface in the enterprise service repository. This is your enterprise service repository where you built all the components, um, individual components. And in the next session, we will look at the integration directory where we will build the end-to-end configuration of your interface. Okay, so we shall see you soon in the next session. Thank you.